Noah Dector Jackson. I'm the CEO and creative director at Complex Games and on Warhammer 40,000 Chaos Gate Daemonhunters.
So Noah, there are a lot of Space Marine chapters in the Warhammer universe. Black Templars, Blood Angels, Space Wolves, Ultramarines. What made your team go with Grey Knights over all the other chapters?
So we actually, funnily enough, we didn't start on the Space Marine side. When we originally conceived of the game that we wanted to make that became Chaos Gate Daemonhunters, we had come in from the standpoint of wanting to build this tactical game with a strategic layer that also that incorporated fighting off and advancing, expanding galactic plague. That was kind of like the chrysalis of the game design idea that led to where we are. And so, given our past experience working on Warhammer 40,000 games, we had conceived of doing this as in the universe. So it was kind of a natural fit when we were initially pitching the game to draw in Nurgle, because he's the Lord of Plagues and all things nasty to do with disease. So that was kind of the chrysalis of what our pitch started as. And through kind of back and forth conversations with Games Workshop and trying to flesh out that core idea, the Grey Knights kind of came in as the natural fit. It's an elite mobile force that, focuses on dealing with key outbreaks of chaos in the Imperium, and that really lined up with our gameplay. So actually, it was sort of Nurgle first, Grey Knights after.
That's interesting. Yeah, and it makes sense too, because even on the tabletop, the Grey Knights are a small force because they're so expensive. One unit of Grey Knights is like a ton of points, so it hurts when you lose them because there's not that many models on the table.
Exactly.
Can you talk about? I only got to spend like a short time playing it, but in my preview, it looks like you have like every weapon in the Space Marines armory. I mean, you have chainsaws, you have power hammers, you have Terminator armor as an option, you have bolters, heavy bolters, heavy flamers, plasma pistols, plasma rifles. What is there anything you don't have in the customization option in terms of weapons?
Oh yeah. I mean, there's a lot. Where we focused on was, from the Grey Knight side. I mean, there's a codex in the universe that sort of outlines what the Grey Knights use, and so that was kind of the boundaries that we worked with. And the Grey Knights use a lot of melee weapons, wide variety of melee weapons, so we kind of had to start there. Halberds, axes, hammers, halberds, swords, hammers, warding staves, and then kind of on the range side, which is still an important part of the game. It's down to the specialist weapons that the Grey Knights use, so psi cannons, silencers, incinerators, and that's where the kind of boundaries are. So yeah, we tried to integrate, at least at this kind of like individual squaddy level, all the possible weapons that Grey Knights can use, and try to work in advantages and disadvantages that made sense in the context of the game for those weapons.
It opens up how it's so much for your team creatively, because you have a squad of is it four or five? It's four, right?
It's four generally. There are scenarios where you play with five on the ground, but it's generally four. Yeah.
So you have a squad of four, and in that squad of four, again touching on the customization option of your game, you have a ton of, like you said, weapons, visual aesthetics, armor, skills, talents, abilities. It was so much. It was almost overwhelming, the amount of customization you can do to the squad. Can you talk a little about that process?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you start off pretty light, but the one thing we do give the player a lot of options on from the ground up is customizing the look and like the name and the feel of their actual squad mates. So we wanted to make sure that within the bounds of what a Grey Knight needs to look like and should look like, you have a lot of room to configure your squad mates and develop a connection with them. Right, and then sort of beyond that, getting into the actual abilities, we've kind of got a core set of classes. There's four sort of like core classes, and then an additional four we call advanced classes that are a little harder to acquire. But each one of those, we wanted to make sure that the class has a theme. Justicar is a like a heavy hitting kind of command unit. and they have different pillars of abilities that you can focus on. Some, providing support for the rest of your squad on the ground through kind of like manipulating the use of action points. Others that are, hard-hitting, resilience-based, tanky type supports. So each of the classes has its own theme, and you get a certain limited number of action points every time you level up for each class. So we wanted to make sure that you didn't feel like every single, Justicar was the same, single apothecary was the same. So we tried to make sure that there were different builds within each class to give you options on how you want to, handle your tactics on the battlefield.
Speaking of the battlefield, you guys kind of went all out on the destructible interactive environments of the game. These levels are huge. I mean, compared to other turn-based RTS games, like they're just gigantic in scale. There's a lot of different zones and areas, a ton of stuff you can interact with, explode, destroy to fall over. You can destroy braziers, pillars, walls. It's like, can you talk about how you came up with that idea and started implementing it into the gameplay?
Sure. Well, terrain destruction is, a big technical challenge. And it's something we really felt for the scale and the scope and the epic quality of, Warhammer 40K. It was kind of needed when you have, this, basically like a building tall unit crush through like a hellbrute, crush through the side of a wall. I mean, that's the kind of like epic experience that most 40K fans at least expect. And what we wanted to do in addition to that, just pure destruction, was to give you as a player tools to manipulate with your tactics on the battlefield. And so that became kind of an evolution of looking at, okay, what sort of things do we see in these kinds of environments? Here's a pillar. Okay, so I want to be able to like knock that over and crush some enemies. There's obviously a lot of fireballs, sources of light in the game. Okay, well, can we like shoot that, knock that over, and create a hazard that we can then use to our advantage in the battlefield? So there's a lot of, blowing up bridges, enemies are crossing. There's a lot of things you can manipulate in terms of terrain destruction that you can use to give you an edge in combat.
So going back to the original, you said the original game, you guys were already talking about using demons, but there are also a ton of other Xenos in the Warhammer 40K universe, Tyranids, Orcs, even like the Eldar. Was it just because they just make good villains in video games you guys went with demons, or just the overall theme of controlling a plagued planet or stuff like that? Did the conversation bring up any of the other Xeno villains in the universe at all?
Yeah, I mean, we like I said, we kind of started with demons, and specifically Nurgles, demon hordes, and the Death Guard that support them. So that's where we began. I mean, there's so much to work with in this IP, and we really like to make sure we focus on something that's cohesive and sort of fits for the kind of campaign we're building. But there's a lot of variety within the scope of fighting Nurgle's forces. Like there's a ton of different units, from cultists through to various Death Guard, Plague Marines, Blight Lords, and then a bunch of sort of tank mechanical units. So we felt we had a lot to work with there within the scope of Nurgle and the Death Guard, to give you kind of a layered challenge, give you like different stratas of units to fight as you went through the course of the campaign to just keep it interesting.
Is it difficult because Warhammer has a huge fan base, a really passionate fan base, and there's always some that's going to be like, why don't they have X unit? Why didn't they include X weapon? Why didn't they include X vehicle? Like, is it hard trying to fit the budget with the time to get everything you needed in to tell your story and design your game?
Yeah, I mean, that's always a challenge because there is so much, right? Like we've just kind of even just scratched the surface in terms of what you can get in, or the types of units that exist for Nurgle anyways. And I think we sort of crossed most of the Grey Knight's forces off, but there's a lot there, as you say. And the hope is in the future that we'll be able to do even more. So that's kind of how we have to look at it. We tried to prioritize these units that we felt really fit the kind of challenges we had and the different design directions we wanted to go with units. But there's a lot more to work with potentially down the line.
Making a video game, it can be really hard to give things a sense of weight and heaviness, but you did a phenomenal job here, from the guns to the movement of the Space Marines while in different armor. Can you talk about that process? Because everything feels like it's so heavy and like, and versus like just really like tactile and mechanical.
Yeah, I mean, it's getting that weight, and like the funny thing about that armor is that even Space Marine power armor is heavy and protective, but Space Marines are also fairly agile, right? Terminator armor not so much, but it really just comes down to working a lot with the visual reference that already exist. These days, Games Workshop is incorporating a lot more kind of animation work into the whole pantheon of what they're showcasing, and that gives us a point of reference to see, okay, this is how GW sees the world, and then our team is just made up by a whole lot of fans of the universe and really want to kind of do right by the IP. So like bolters are rocket propelling ranged weapons, right? It's not just pellet guns, so you needed to add that extra weight to those gunshots. You need a lot, explosions to have a huge effect, and there it goes back to your discussion about destructible terrain. You want a grenade to like send walls flying, right? You want units to go through and be able to crush down obstacles and send their opponents flying. So it was really a big part of creating that visceral quality, that sort of to combine the fast-paced, sort of aggressive mechanics of the game with kind of like a weight and force that fits particularly the knights, being these biogenically engineered super soldiers.
Now, obviously some of these models are in CAD form for Games Workshop to inject mold the models. Are you able to use those CAD files in your game to modify them, rig them, or are they just kind of for reference only?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's just reference. We still have to build something kind of from the ground up that matches the model designs. Like that's a requirement. We gotta hit model. But yeah, unfortunately, those files like that just aren't super useful for the in-game models when we're sort of creating it to be optimized for real-time rendering and to be animated with the specialized rig. It's kind of like you have to attack it a different way when you're building those kinds of assets.
No, speaking to this game specifically, is it difficult in designing these encounters? Because obviously, like every player kind of wants to just shoot it till it dies, but that's not always the best tactic, and you don't want encounters to be too easy, but you don't want them to be too hard. So you kind of there's got to be a lot of design work that goes into each one of these battles and missions to make sure that it's fun, challenging, and not too easy and not too difficult.
Yeah, and like we're trying to, it's always a challenge to like hit that right mark, because we want the game to be challenging, but then we also want to have, in which we have like different difficulty settings. So if you want a bit of a lighter time with it, you can take the more merciful settings, and if you want a bigger challenge, you can take the more legendary ruthless settings. But finding that balance, striking that balance, is always a challenge. And where we tried to focus on in terms of our gameplay, as I mentioned before, is we wanted a tactics game where you're really incentivized to be mobile, to strike, to get in close, and then effectively kind of create combinations by taking out units, generating more action points through various bonuses that you get from that, and kind of continuing your turn for as long as possible to just wipe out the enemy opposition. So that was sort of like part of the thought process, is because these characters, these knights are so powerful, we wanted to give the players that sense of their power through the core mechanics and incentivize them to fight like the knights do, while still making it a challenge, right? And still introducing sufficient challenges so that it didn't feel like it was just a cakewalk walking through.
You have an interesting mechanic with a timer. Some games, a timer means like game over, you failed the mission, you didn't do it in the 4 turns or 5 rounds or whatnot. But your timer just makes things, it doesn't end the mission, but it makes things procedurally more difficult if you keep farting around or missing attacks or not playing tactically. Like you could find yourself outnumbered really quickly. Can you talk about that mechanic a little bit?
Yeah, so it's not, it effectively ends up being like a timer, but it varies from mission to mission depending on how corrupt the map is. So what that is our warp surge meter, and the kind of like lore explanation for it is that the warp is this very unpredictable psychic existence. It's another plane, and all the Grey Knights have to tap into the warp to use their psychic powers, and that's the domain where chaos exists and exerts its force. So as you fight in missions that are more and more corrupt, they've been infected more by this plague, that warp meter is going to accelerate much more quickly, and as soon as it hits 100%, then you have to deal with a warp surge event. And these are kind of like the semi-randomized events that can have an impact on combat. You can deal with having to deal with more reinforcements, or the entire landscape of combat can change because new hazards get introduced. The enemies that you're currently fighting with get augmented with mutations, giving them extra bonuses to their abilities and so on, and changing the way they fight. So that's the kind of variable that you always have to keep in mind on the battlefield as that warp surge meter is working its way up. Is okay, something is going to happen here that I'm going to have to deal with, whether it's more enemies or augmentations to my opponents right now. How do I factor that in? How do I adjust my tactics to make sure that this doesn't take me off guard? And you can manipulate that meter too. There are some abilities, you have some capabilities to kind of reduce it or cut it down temporarily. But yeah, it's going to be a constant thing that you'll have to be concerned about on the battlefield.
I mean, obviously, Space Marines, or in this case, Grey Knights and Demons, great tabletop counterparts. The models look fantastic, but do you have any plans for online PvP, Grey Knights versus human demons, or Grey Knights versus other Grey Knights? Anything like that in the future?
So I can't speak to plans outside of launch at this point. Sam is watching carefully. We can't talk about anything beyond the scope of this campaign.
Anything?
Sorry.
No, that's fine. That's fine. Anything that you really want, you and your team really wanted in the game, or were hoping to put in the game but just ran out of time or budget or anything like that? Any fun stories you can share?
No. I think we've managed. We've been working on this game for a long time. Keep in mind that we pitched back in 2016. Been working on it since 2017. So we've had a lot of time to flesh this game out and to make it the campaign we want it to be. There's a lot of ways that we can add to it, and other areas that we could foresee adding to the campaign down the line. But that's for future conversations.
And then talk about the relationship with the Games Workshop. What do they provide you in terms of support or even tech to help make this game a reality?
Yeah, so a big part of that process is they have sort of a key member, liaison, producer who is interacting with us all the time. We're constantly going back and forth on, especially early on in the process, about what our plans for design are, run it by them. We go back and forth on ideas for abilities. So it's a very iterative process with them. And they're sort of reviewing everything from art to sound to design all the way through. So it's a very collaborative process. In the end, though, we're left to build the game, as that's what we do. But there's no kind of like end of the game that isn't really reviewed by Games Workshop along the process, and they pay a lot of attention to making sure that the game itself lines up with the IP, with what's expected in the IP. So there's a lot of rigor in that.
Do they send you and your team any combat patrols, Grey Knight models, stuff like that, so you can make sure that everything's right, or is it all digital now?
There's a lot of it's digital, but we do have a large collection of models that we've used as point of reference. So yeah, absolutely.
That's great. And when does the game come out, and what platforms are you aiming for on launch date?
Yes, we're launching on May 5th for PC on both Steam and the Epic stores.
Because I have to ask, and I know you probably can't talk about it, do you have any plans for consoles, PS5, Xbox Series X and S?
At this point, I cannot speak to any plans relating to any consoles.
Awesome, Nora. And then where can people go to find more information about your game? Do you have a Discord, a forum they can go to talk to you and give feedback, all that good stuff?
Yeah, so we've got a lot of social. There's Chaos Gate, the website. There's believe there's a sign up description for more information there. There's the Twitter for Chaos Gate Daemonhunters. There's Facebook as well. So we're kind of in Instagram. We're covering the gamut, I think. And I'm sure Sam can follow up also with some links through all those locations as well.
Awesome. And then I guess my fun little bonus question would be like, obviously this is about Grey Knights, but are we going to see any cross with, we saw a little bit of cross with Imperial Guard. Will we see Adeptus Mechanicus? Any other like supporting factions coming in to help the Grey Knights out?
Well, I mean, even in the materials that are already live, like just on the ship, your sort of main cast, one of them is a Grey Knight, one of them is an Inquisitor, and she's really the sort of central character of the game. So the Inquisition is on your side. And then also another sort of key player on board is from the Adeptus Mechanicus, which is Lunette, who's your main tech priest on the ship. And she's very crucial as well for kind of advancing some of the strategic elements of the game. In terms of additional sort of factions that appear over the course of the game, I don't think beyond what's already been shown, we can't speak to anything else. But yeah,
We'll save that for surprises for people who want to play the campaign. Yeah, there you go.
Indeed.